Hello and welcome to a special Firstpost conversation. Growing concerns about a new age of American imperialism around the world. First, the United States captured a sitting president from Venezuela. Now they're talking about taking over foreign territories elsewhere, like in Greenland and Canada. These actions seem to have put Latin America on edge. This is a region that is very close to mainland United States. It also features prominently in Donald Trump's latest foreign policy doctrine, what he calls the Monroe Doctrine. Now, Trump says he wants unassailable American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And as he showed in Venezuela, he's not afraid to flex his military muscle. But what does this approach mean for the rest of the region, and how are his plans unfolding in Venezuela? Let me put these questions to my guest, Mr. Ivan Duque Marquez, who's the former president of Colombia. He led the country from 2018 to 2022, and his presidency also overlapped with the first term of Mr. Donald Trump. Thank you so much, Mr. Marquez, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Now, in the lead up to the operation that I just mentioned, you had supported the US strikes on the alleged drug boats near Venezuelan waters. And in the past, you have called for an operation to oust Mr. Maduro as well. But considering how things have unfolded since then, the fact that Maduro's handpicked deputy is still in power, have you changed your opinion of that operation, or you still stand by it?
So let me try to put this in a broader frame. The first thing is the operation against Nicolas Maduro was lawful since he was indicted in the United States for narco trafficking. He's not legitimate, and he was not a legitimate president in Venezuela. In fact, he stole 3 elections in a row, and he was the equivalent in Latin America to a Slobodan Milosevic, a systematic violator of human rights, someone who had practiced genocide, and who had silenced any voice against his administration, having many of the leaders in the democratic resistance to leave Venezuela, and triggering one of the most horrendous, massive migration mobilizations ever in Latin America due to the lack of opportunities and the destruction of social capital. So I think the operation against Maduro, I support it, and I will continue to support it. Now, Delcy Rodriguez is not a legitimate president, but we understand that it is part of the U.S. strategy to stabilize the country, to recover the country, and to guarantee a successful transition to democracy. Those 3 elements can overlap. So it's very important that the world and the United States understands that Delcy Rodriguez is going to try to play games to preserve power. But I think there's enough knowledge about her and her inner circle. So I think the United States will put pressure for the release of all political prisoners, to the dismantle of all the repression apparatus, to guarantee the return of all the democratic resistance leaders, and to stabilize this into what should be the sequence of the calling of free elections and guarantee the transition. But also having in mind that there has to be some kind of a board that guarantees that all this sequencing happens with transparency and guaranteeing the rights of the Venezuelan people. And the person who has to be also in that table is Edmundo Gonzalez, who's now the legitimate president of Venezuela, who won the election in 2024. So it's very important to understand the sequence. And yes, we will support. And I think the message that we are trying to give also to the United States, thanking for the operation, is yes, it was very important that the tyrant is out, but now the tyranny has to be dismantled.
But have you seen steps towards that end being taken? I ask because President Trump has not mentioned anything about freedoms or democracy in Venezuela. He's also ruled out the possibility of a popular politician, the opposition leader Machado, from returning to Venezuela. Instead, all the focus has been on the oil resources in Venezuela, and he brought together those oil bosses to discuss what they could invest in the country. So the conversation right now seems to be around Venezuela's resources, not necessarily democracy or freedoms in the country.
Well, I think your question is pretty relevant, because I think when you look at everything that has been said by all the people involved, you would find out that, for example, Secretary Rubio has talked about this sequencing of stabilization, recovery, and transition. And in that consideration, democracy is a very important part of it. You've also heard from the U.S. Secretary of Energy that even for the energy investments that the U.S. projects to make in Venezuela through the American companies, all the CEOs have publicly said in front of President Trump that the current conditions in Venezuela make the country uninvestable. So a return to democracy, to the rule of law, to the certainty of legal procedures is essential for them to have a long-term guarantee to invest in Venezuela. But also, members of Congress in the US, and you have to consider that this has been a bipartisan and bicameral issue, they've all raised their voice so that the return of democracy is the end game of all this. Also, having rule of law and having to reestablish and maybe re-engineer the Venezuelan military forces. Because it's very important to understand that there's no rule of law in Venezuela today, that there are no credible institutions in Venezuela today, that it was literally a criminal organization that was running the country. So you have to basically solve this puzzle, try to have a sequencing to rebuild the institutions, to rebuild confidence, and that won't happen without a transition to democracy. But the other thing is, when you look at polls that have been practiced in Venezuela in the last weeks, Maria Corina Machado has more than 78% of the popular support in the country. So if there were new elections, she will win by a landslide. And she's the only credible leader with enough citizen support that can, after this sequence of events, guarantee a new birth of institutional stability in Venezuela. So I think the US knows this in detail, but they also know they have to stabilize by putting all the pressure to all the remnant leaders of the tyranny so that they can move forward with this agenda, and that they know that if they don't follow this agenda, they will also be taken to US courts, since most of them have been indicted. So I think there has been a part of pragmatism in all this, but I believe the idealism has not been lost, and without the return of democracy, Venezuela will not be investable.
Right. Let's also take a step back now and look at what the attack on Venezuela and the operation to capture Maduro means for the larger region, because a number of countries in Latin America did condemn it as foreign intervention and an unlawful operation on foreign soil. Do you think that what happened in Venezuela would perhaps embolden President Trump to consider similar operations elsewhere? You all hinted at operations in Cuba, in your country, Colombia. Do you see this template being replicated elsewhere in Latin America?
Well, yeah, I think what you're asking has to be also to be disaggregated, because first of all, Venezuela was not a sovereign country when Maduro was ruling the country. Venezuela was already invaded by enemies of democracy, by enemies of the rule of law, and was also turning into a safe haven for terrorist organizations that also violated the Venezuelan sovereignty. FARC people were there. ELN members were there, Hezbollah members were there. Even people that were close to the Islamic State had been in Venezuela in the last 12 years that Maduro was in office. So the sovereignty of Venezuela was already violated by a regime that used repression and protection of terrorist organizations as part of their cornerstone of guaranteeing their own stability and trying to take all the richness out of Venezuela and put it in the crooks' pockets in international finance institutions. So it's very important to acknowledge that. Now, based on this, the United States had an indictment that comes from the year 2020 that has been bipartisanly and bicamerally supported, because Nicolas Maduro was a threat to the US national security, to the hemispheric security. And even in the case of our country, Colombia, he provided safe haven to most of the Colombian terrorist organizations that plotted against our institutions. So if I do support that operation, yes, I do. And yes, I will always be a voice supporting that operation.
But Mr. Marquez,
but also what I value about what I also value about that operation is that the operation was aimed to start creating a change, political, social, and economic, that would allow Venezuela to be rebuilt. Right. Now, you asked me about other countries. You know the experience of Panama in the late 80s, when Noriega was a similar case. He stole the elections. U.S. intervened and guaranteed the return of democracy. And since then, not only has been a successful example of democracy, but has also allowed Panama to flourish economically and socially, and expand the middle class and reduce poverty. So I think there are cases in which these interventions have worked. Now, right. In other cases, in other debates, I'm not going to get into those debates because I think those debates are now part of a broader international conversation. The case of Greenland and other cases, I think they're more complicated than just giving whether I give sympathy or not. I'm not in favor of territorially expanding countries. I have condemned the territorial expansion through aggressions. So I think this tension has to be solved diplomatically. And I think the aim has to be that Europe and the United States understand that protecting Greenland as it is, protecting Greenland as part of Denmark territory, but having some kind of individual autonomy, they need to be reinforced in terms of security. And hopefully, I think this can be solved through diplomacy, but guaranteeing the overall aim, which is to protect the territory of Greenland of being attacked in the near future by other powers that want to expand their territory.
Right. Now, you say that this was a lawful attack, but I have to push back on that. You were president of your country in 2022 when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and you were one of the few people in your hemisphere who openly condemned that and called what was a brutal genocide, I believe were the words that you used on what Russia was doing in Ukraine. Now, in the case of Venezuela, yes, there was a US indictment of Maduro, but the fact is there was no global sanction for the United States to go ahead and conduct these operations. Yes, Maduro was an autocrat who rigged elections, but the fact is there was no international sanction for President Trump to do what he did. Does that not set a worrying precedent for your region and the rest of the world?
Well, I think you raised a very important question there because what happened in the case of Ukraine was an attack on a sovereign democratic territory in order to annexate the Ukrainian territory to Russia. That is something very much different to what we have seen in Venezuela. There was an indictment. This was not an invasion. This was not taking the Venezuelan territory and annex it to the United States. This was a lawful from the United States legal standpoint, but it was also lawful in terms of the Latin America or the Inter-American Democratic Charter that was signed by Venezuela, by the United States, and by most of the countries in the hemisphere in September 11, 2001, where we defend democracy. And Maduro was a dictator that had taken power from the people, that had violated human rights systematically, that had also stolen elections from the free will of the Venezuelan people. So this was a hemispheric threat. And I think most of the countries in Latin America do support the intervention, as this is a starting point to the recovery of institutional stability and democracy in Venezuela. Very much different from what we have seen in Ukraine, which was an aggression in order not only to take Ukrainian territory by the Russians, but also to destroy a democratic system in Ukraine. That's why my voice has been there, will always be there in favor of the Ukrainian people. But let's not try to make comparisons that are not really similar or that can have even any kind of elements of synchronicity. What we have seen in the case of Venezuela is a clear defense of liberty and the return of democracy. What we have seen in Ukraine is an abusive, genocidal attack from Russia to the Ukrainian people.
Right. I'd like to focus on your country and your equation with President Trump. He's called the president of Colombia, Mr. Gustavo Petro, a sick man who likes selling cocaine to the United States. He's also hinted at possibly repeating what he did in Venezuela and Colombia. Do you agree with President Trump's characterization of President Petro?
So I'm not going to get into specific adjectives that have been used from President Trump against President Petro or vice versa. What I'm just going to talk is about the facts. So the fact is that during the Petro administration, we have seen the dismantle of all the manual eradication groups against illegal crops. We have seen the lowest seizure rate as a percentage of potential production of cocaine. We have seen an empowerment of kingpins of terrorist and narco-trafficking organizations by naming them peace builders without any kind of persecution by the Colombian authorities. And that's why we have reached record highs, not only in the production of cocaine, but record highs in illegal crops. Is this a threat to Colombia? Yes. Is this a threat to the hemisphere? Yes. And is this a threat to the U.S. national security? Yes. So my question is, why President Petro has not fulfilled a bilateral agenda so that we can keep the right rates of eradication, the right rates of seizure, and the reestablishment of aerial spray an instrument that was banned in 2015, and that during my administration, we created a blueprint roadmap in order to put it back in order and help the authorities be effective against narco trafficking. In fact, Petro dismantled that blueprint. So I think those are the reasons why the United States have raised a continuous worry about the way Petro is conducting power in Colombia. Petro now has just few months in office. He actually called President Trump. He asked for a meeting, and President Trump is giving that meeting on February 3rd. What I hope out of that meeting is that, yes, we have to continue having a bilateral relationship that has lasted for more than 200 years, but Petro is not going to get a free ride or a free lunch because, in fact, he really has to reestablish what he has dismantled in order for Colombia to be effective against the cartels.
Right. Now, in the case of some countries in the region, President Trump has offered military support. Like, for example, in Mexico, he has said that I've offered repeatedly to President Sheinbaum that I'll deploy my troops and I'll clear out the cartels. Would you welcome a similar offer to Colombia, where the US soldiers come to your country, fight the cartels and the drug trafficking, and then return? Or would you feel that's a violation of your country's sovereignty?
Well, I think Colombia has a very interesting example of good cooperation with the United States. Colombia launched Plan Colombia in the year 2000 in collaboration with the United States, and we were able to expand our military capacities, our helicopter capacity, our intelligence capacity, and that's why from the year 2000 to the year 2015, where my predecessor banned the aerial spray, Colombia had a very successful result from basically 200,000 hectares of illegal crops to 50,000 hectares. And we were able to dismantle great part of FARC operators. We were able to fight many of the narco-terrorist organizations in Colombia. Even in my administration, we worked very closely and we got a lot of intelligence support. We even had U.S. personnel visiting continuously Colombia. But we did most of the operations in the field with our own troops, but with U.S. support and also support from other countries. The fact is that Colombia is a non-permanent member of NATO, but it's an associate member, so we can also get good practices and good advisory in many of the ways that we conduct operations. And Colombia supported many of the Central American countries and South American countries in the fight against terrorism. And we were the leaders with the United States of the Orion campaign in the Caribbean that was also aimed to destroy vessels and planes transporting drugs. And it was pretty much an experience of deterrence that was quite successful.
Right.
So Colombia has a good story from the past and also during my administration. And I think helping Mexico fight the cartels with much better intelligence, with much better equipment, and even with more lethal means of precision against the kingpins of the cartels, I think that will be beneficial to Mexico, as long, obviously, as in the field are implemented by Mexican personnel, but with the U.S. support. So
Right.
I will always support U.S. Participation hand in hand with Latin American countries fighting the common hemispheric security threats.
Right. Finally, just quickly, let me ask you a question. When Donald Trump says that according to my doctrine, the Western Hemisphere has to be completely controlled by the United States and it has to have an unassailable dominance in this region, what's the message to other powers like India or China or Russia? Should we expand on our economic and military ties with these countries? Should we pull back from the Western Hemisphere? What's the point of this Monroe Doctrine and U.S. dominance of the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I think there has to be a clear understanding of the historical roots of the inter-American relationship. Because basically the Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine to protect the whole hemisphere. And we all work together. The fact President Monroe, let me just give you an example. President Monroe in 1821 recognized the independence of my country, Colombia. And it was the first country to recognize the independence of Colombia. So if President Monroe would have had the idea of taking over the whole region, he would have not recognized Colombia. President Monroe wanted to have a much better understanding, coordination, and try to find common objectives hemispherically. And that was the purpose of that doctrine. And also, what we have said in Latin America is that the inter-American system has to be strengthened. That's why we have an Organization of American States that is based in Washington, D.C., where the U.S. is there, but most of the countries and all the countries in the region sit down, discuss common objectives. So the inter-American system has to be strengthened. And the same thing with the Inter-American Development Bank that was also founded with the support of the United States in the late 50s with the help of Douglas Dillon, and the U.S. is the largest shareholder. So we use that instrument to expand lending for development purposes in Latin America. I don't think we're talking about taking over the Latin American territory. But in fact, I think it's strategical that Latin American countries and Caribbean countries have a much better coordination with the United States on security, on development, on finance, on the environment, on critical materials, because that would strengthen the whole hemisphere. And let me say this again, in order to have the whole hemisphere in a much greater condition again, it needs to have permanent coordination. And that implies fighting the common threats. But it also implies having co-responsibility. Because yes, we have to fight narco trafficking from the Latin American side, from the Colombian side. But also we expect the United States to do much more in terms of reducing consumption so that both elements can go hand in hand. So I do believe that the conceivable doctrine has to be a much stronger integration, much stronger coordination based on values and virtues, starting with the respect of democratic values.
Right. Mr. Marquez, you seem to be confident that President Trump does have a playbook for what he's doing in Venezuela. That all we're seeing right now is a stabilization program which will eventually lead to free and fair elections and a liberal regime taking over in Caracas. We haven't seen indications of that yet, but let's see how things unfold in Venezuela. Thank you so much.
Well, let me just add something. I think what needs to occur in the following weeks is the full liberation of all political prisoners.
Right.
Giving the right guarantees for all the democratic resistant leaders to be back in Venezuela, defending their values, their principles, raising their voice, and having much more contact with the people, but also having the institutional reconstruction blueprint, which demands not only a new constitution, new legislation, it requires a new electoral system, but also the return of a liberal democracy that brings stability, the rule of law, and progress to the Venezuelan society. I am glad that Secretary Rubio has raised the stabilization, reconstruction, and transition as elements of the blueprint, and that they can overlap. Well, I think the acceleration of all this may allow Venezuela, maybe by the end of the year, to be experiencing the first great breaths of liberty that are demanded by the people.
Well, some of the political prisoners have been released. Let's see if more are, and what sort of long-term impact this operation and the capture of Maduro will have on the region. Thank you so much, Mr. Marquez, for speaking to us on First Post.
Thank you so much. It's actually Mr. Duque. My second last name is Marquez, so it's Duque Marques. Thank you so much, and it has been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Mr. Duque Marquez.
The world doesn't fit in boxes, so why should your news? From battlefields to negotiation tables, from internet outrage to real-world injustice. The conversations everyone is having and the ones they're avoiding. It's the same show, but this new year, First Post America gets a new look. I'm Kerry Johnston, and this is First Post America.